Welcome everyone to Pontus Fathom podcast number 40. Today we're going to be talking about Beyond Pandora and looking at some Neptunian themes in Avatar, mostly around the topics of some of the some of the deeper topics that are coming up in this Avatar franchise, let's call it, around colonization, escapism, schizophrenia, and redemption. I'm going to be taking an approach to this through I've got these two Liz Green books on the table on astrological Neptune and astrological Saturn. So we're coming out of our Dragon series that we had done, and I noticed there was a couple of themes, especially in our last couple podcasts, where we talked a lot about Saturn, and we talked about re-looking at some of the baggage that comes with our, let's say, institutionalized traditions, and then also as individual thinkers. And I kind of always frame it in the sense of as creators, like say that we're just making world building for our, for a novel or something like this, as a way of speaking about it, right? So you can take your inspirations from many places, right? So you could be inspired by psychology. You think of people developing complex characters by creating astrology charts for those characters, or using psychology to a deep understanding of psychology to give a character in a fictional world psychological weight and its believability, right? And I think that a lot of these themes in Avatar, so let's call it as myth building, right? You want to build that mythology of the world. Lots of interesting things come up. We can talk a little bit about, James Cameron. We'll talk about mainly Saturn and Neptune for this one, but we're going to go into a little bit of comparison too to some things I see in Philip K. Dick's Martian Time Slip book, which is strangely has lots of plot crossovers that I think will be interesting to kind of get beyond the hype of Avatar and see, what we're working with here. And then also some themes from Cameron's other works. Especially I wanted to talk about Aliens and Terminator, and I thought that was some interesting his cross film kind of drifting subject, let's call it. And then finally we'll kind of wrap up into this idea of what the Neptunian quest for redemption is, and how there's good aspects and bad aspects of our films. Some things are inspiring us to make those changes. Some things are also some subversions. I think if we're aware of those things, we can sort of understand, how we could be inspired by art and, bring that to our lives, and also look at things where we're sort of being, manipulated or something like that. So let's get into it. Before we do, I'm going to do a quick shout out to our bookstore below, Pontus Fathom Press. As I mentioned, I am working on turning these podcasts into a 3-volume set. I will be publishing these throughout this year. Just to give you guys a quick shout out, we also have gotten the first 2 volumes of Artificial Psychology of Desiring Machines by August Moldenhauer, Impedance and Admittance in Desiring Machines, and The Psychoanalysis of Artificial Intelligence. Those are both available out there. We'll actually go into some themes of this, especially around that weird idea of Avatar as a literal avatar, and the idea of artificial intelligence that's been coming up a lot. So we'll be getting into some of these. I'll probably do a podcast or 2 just doing a deep dive lecture on these books. 3rd volume will come out later this year, Computational Complexity and Psychiatric Agency. Still doing the proofs of those. So if you guys want to go check out the bookstore or our Patreon, it helps us out with the channel. So let's jump right into today's podcast. So starting out, we're going to talk a little bit about Saturn and Neptune. And if you guys had watched my The Dragon and the Cross podcast, episode 38, I talked a little bit about Jung's call in the Ion about, hey, what's this future integration, let's say, of the Christ impulse, but also the impulse to understand this dragon concept, right? And in that one, I kind of, I walked that fine line of saying, in the end, it is a redemptive Christ story, right? The idea that the dragon becomes the heart of Jesus, right? That's the idea of he is the massive force of this, right? So I think that quest for redemption, or even my let's call it my exploration of it, my curiosity in that direction, really talks about the Saturn-Neptune aspect, right? And I think this is what's very interesting. So Saturn is our planet in psychology that kind of talks about, and we've mentioned this in a couple of Saturn podcasts. Saturn is the planet of karma, time, of discipline. So in the sense of this, it's approaching a difficulty in life with the idea of its transformational power, right? So in medieval times, Saturn was seen as, or even later than that, but up to Elizabethan times, say, like Saturn was always sort of seen, like in the Picatrix and all these things, as a bad sign. Born under the bad sign was Saturn, because this is where your troubles are going to come from. But in a current kind of Aquarian view of things, Saturn just means psychologically that kind of shadow work you might need to do, right? So the idea is you have you are overcoming maybe whether it's environmental or genomic or some kind of challenge in your life. You learn about that challenge, and then you make the changes to adapt a better way. So the idea here is there's nothing leading you astray, or there's nothing that's out to get you. It's just like, sometimes you need to take responsibility and move forward, right? And I think Saturn kind of shows that dynamic of that. Neptune, on the other hand, is a different kind of planet. Neptune is more of that spectrum between escapism. So the idea of escapism is all of the things that ask us, I think film is ruled by Neptune in general, right? I think having intoxication, all of these things where you escape the reality. And then that goes across the spectrum to the idea of a spiritual quest or redemption quest, right? So Neptune kind of rules religions, but it also rules cults, and it rules escapism, but it also rules being out of step with things so that you can, let's say, you won't let 2,000 years of a tradition stop you from learning for yourself and understanding for yourself. Now, if you put Saturn and Neptune in aspect together, then you can start to see how if you put it in mythological terms, Saturn was before Poseidon, Neptune, right? And then the world was divided amongst the underworld and the earth and the sky and the sea, right? So that primordial gap between the generative force out of nothing of Saturn that can bring the future into being, and then Neptune is that watery world where we can explore these things. And I think that Cameron does a great job, especially with this most recent film, of transporting us into this world of Pandora, right? So we see the idea of that in those planets. You see Pandora is actually the moon, and there's a giant planet, I believe they call it Polyphemus, is the giant Neptunian-looking planet in the Avatar movies. And then Pandora is just like the green jungle plant moon. It's a green jungle moon. So let's kind of go into a little bit of these natures of Neptune. I've got a couple quotes here that I want to take a look at here. I've got one. It says, Neptunian political perspective clearly reflects the longing for the lost innocence of the paradise garden. A profound inner sense of corruption and sin is equated with the corruption and sin of the outer world. But whether violent or gentle, archaism works toward the restoration of the primal Eden by getting rid of the serpent, who is invariably projected on a scapegoat. This can be constructive when the serpent appears as a chemical pollution and as the destruction of the environment. It rapidly becomes a problem when the serpent is projected into all technological and material advances, whether they improve the quality of life, and it becomes a dark Neptunian flood when the serpent is identified with any racial, religious, social, national group which appears inferior, or is projected onto anyone that seems different in opinions, lifestyle, tastes, or appearances. Archaism is as common amongst political groups which idealize a past golden age, as it is amongst spiritual groups who idealize a lost esoteric tradition. It is not a new phenomenon. It may lead to the right as often as it does to the left. So this is, I think this gets you right into the thick of things, this quote. The idea here is, well, we kind of do have these Eden themes, we have these paradise themes, but then we also have, and you can see in Avatar, we'll go through this in the Avatar film, how sometimes, we are humans, and yet the humans are made to be the bad guys. And in a way, we are the Na'vi, right? And I think that this is trying to show that aspect. I see this as the aspect of the Saturn-Neptune dilemma. Like, how do we transform the humans not into the destroyers of the Na'vi world? How do we become both people, right? And obviously, there's this is purposefully played out in the movies. And I think the two movies are almost doing the same plot, just in a different layer. Now they're going to branch it out into water and other realms of it to kind of key into certain messages, right? But that idea of the politicalization is huge, right? That's a huge one. Let me see if I got this other quote here. This one here. So then we also have the origin of the Grail legend, a reputed with a certain 20th century esoteric sect to lie in the Gnostic Christianity. It is impossible to either prove or disprove such a claim, itself characteristic of Neptune. So Neptune has by nature this idea of unprovable, right? You cannot prove it. The idea of the reason why religions are so easily subverted is because they're vague, right? They just open up these ideas. And somebody who believes like the tree of life is evil and you're eating a fruit and it's evil, like, well, that's a story that's been around for a while. And yes, there are dangers to it, but also there's the idea of a responsibility as owning up to like this interaction. We do have knowledge now and we have to own it. So we cannot only be stuck in an outmoded way of thinking, right? So it says here, we know a considerable amount about the Gnostic literature of the first centuries of the Christian era, but none of it mentions the Grail legend. On the other hand, the essential qualities of the legend, particularly its emphasis on moral purity, suffering, and transcendence over the physical world, reflect many of the fundamental themes of Gnostic teaching in spirit, if not letter. One of the characteristics of this and other Neptunian spiritual motifs is that the Grail seems to its adherents to belong to a single arcane tradition. The feeling of familiarity, the coming home, which often accompanies Neptunian mystical experience, is usually explained by the assumption that it is the absolute truth, hidden from those who have been blinded by materialism, but immediately recognizable to the spiritually discerning. So this is kind of, again, this is the feeling that gets evoked in the Avatar films, right? You kind of identify with this paradise world, all of those biblical themes, those kind of Lemurian themes that come out in it that we'll go into later in this talk. And this is great. Certainly Neptunian dualism and themes of redemption have been with us for a long time. But rather than seen as a single one of the motifs belonging to continuous oral and written tradition, sometimes spuriously claimed, it might be more helpful to understand Neptune's world as archetypal and therefore perpetually recurrent within the human beings, whether a familiar spiritual body or teachings or not. The universality of Neptunian motifs for necessity of suffering and sacrifice, the sharing or abjuring of personal possessions, the absolute obedience to the cult or guru, the imminent destruction of the world, the second coming, or simul advent of spiritual avatar, there you go, or supernatural being, the annihilation of the wicked and the salvation of the elect may be readily seen amongst a wide variety of present-day groups and cults. So now you can see that this is kind of where some of this works out. And even look, it's got talking about Krishna consciousness, theosophical societies. Every time you're going to go into these deep traditions, right, these traditions that connect deeply, you will find some mysteries in there. And I think that Avatar is sort of borrowing from those traditions to get people to, probably there is the element of, a global warming element. But I want to kind of read through that a bit as like, well, don't let that hijack you. Get through to what's really interesting about this world building. And that the fact is, the next time you're out in nature, really appreciate that and think of, hey, how do we get that? How do we keep that natural world that's around us? So some of the themes that came up in our Christ and the Dragon podcast, where it's sort of like going back to those indigenous traditions that actually got kind of buried over by colonialism, which will go into the colonialism talk too. Okay, so a couple more quotes from this one and one from the Neptune book. One quick one was, we're sort of talking here a little bit about Plato's Republic. And this talks a little bit about low utopianism and then high utopian form. Rather than Eden-like, it partakes in much of Saturn as of Neptune. It says, he gives us the individual citizen's happiness, a little thought. Right? So then we kind of go into Thomas More's Utopia, and he says, this great philosophical romance was written in 1516 by a man who had the sun in Aquarius in a close square to Neptune, conjunct the ascendant. Neptune was transiting through Aquarius, and his natal sun squared natal Neptune when he wrote the book. Thomas More was the first writer to use the word utopia. In Greek, it means nowhere. His work offers us a model of the ideal society, although sometimes subject to conflict, is mysteriously purged of envy. Every member is joyfully willing to embrace from his neighbor's good fortune. I think this is sort of in that connectivity with the Na'vi, right? We kind of see this in the connectivity to the Na'vi. They have those braids that they can meld with the animals. Listen, pet a cat, you're going to feel the same thing, right? Go throw your dog a stick, you feel the same thing. It's not magic. It's not like movie magic. It's just like have a conversation with somebody in a coffee shop, right? You're going to have these same feelings. We don't have to have this tentacle thing, right? We have it already, right? So this is the point of it, right? But I think it's pretty interesting, right? The idea of looking at the utopia isn't a political agenda. It's not a thing where we have to sign up for something and be angry. The utopia is, taking care of your garden in your house, taking care of your pets and your neighbors and your friends and your family. That's kind of that's it. That's all the Na'vi were doing. And then as we see this program will progress, I'm guessing in spoilers, whatever, that this will be the theme of the redemption of our new human, antagonist in the Avatar series to come. We'll see him really do what Jake did. Like Jake figured out the Na'vi was the way, and I'm sure this will be the plot. There'll be a redemption plot there. Finally, the last one here is just talking about the Saturn-Neptune. The strong Saturnine individual or collective is usually well equipped to cope with whatever life brings because of a good adaptation to the demands of the present. At its worst, Saturn is a tyrant. The need to control all overwhelms all other urges and creates absolute dictatorship, whether as an individual psyche or a nation. Now listen, if there's any calls to like environmentalism or one world religions and all these are things you have to take with a grain of salt, right? The person who has identified too strongly with a Saturn may attempt to deny or suppress every trace of dependency, vulnerability, or disorder. So too may a nation with a planet prominent. Neptune's longing is what renders us most dependent, vulnerable, and disorderly, least equipped to cope with the stresses and strains of daily existence. This is back to the Gurdjieff kind of thinking, right? Go wash your dishes, go take care of what's around you in your life, act locally, right? I think a lot of this is, don't believe everything without a little verifying. Use common sense. Try to think of what would my grandparents do. Don't do exactly what they did, but kind of ground yourself in this thinking, right? This is the politics of Saturn-Neptune are often extreme, particularly with conjunction and hard aspects. Whichever side they belong to, the left or the right, thus becoming curiously similar as they proceed to enact their archetypal roles. This is where it's calls to, listen, any call to a movement that's telling you to, if there's a good side and a bad side to everything, you should really think for yourself, right? This is what's, we have communication. We can talk to each other. We can work through things. So that's okay. So that's a few of those Neptunian ideas. I kind of want to go into this Saturn example I've got here. This is just a Neptune-Saturn contact. So it says in mythology, Neptune was given dominion over the waters and the subterranean passageways of the earth. And they were taken from Saturn, dividing up the three sons. Pluto gets the underworld, Jupiter the heavens, and then the waters were given to Neptune. And it says mythological Neptune can be quite inimical and capable of arbitrarily overwhelming ships and the passengers, as well as precipitating earthquakes, floods, and tidal waves. So you've got this Neptunian nature. We also used to viewing Neptune as a kind of influence astrologically. It says the higher octave of Venus, a symbol of universal compassion and love elevated above the level of personal relationships, right? So now we see this in the film, right? The idea of Jake's transformation, right? Jake goes through the transformation. He says, you know what, I'm going to give up my human form, and I will be part of these people because I want to defend what they have. But also, Jake's going to serve as an ambassador as the humans are leaving the dying earth, and they want to come to basically gentrify Pandora. And I think Jake stands as that sort of ambassador, as a person who's like, well, you have to adopt these ways. It's almost like the idea we used to have this old idea of like people would become that were immigrants to, like, let's say a mid 20th century idea. When you were an immigrant to the United States, people all learned English, right? It used to be a normal thing. I mean, even my immigrant parents used to do that, and that's changed over time. Like that view has changed. But there is something about, you're in a land, you're already living in a land that has certain cultures, right? And I think that we've gotten very oversensitive about cultures, and living in another country myself, it's like, you have to respect the culture of the land you live in, and it will change you as you live in these lands, right? And I think the bigger metaphor is we're all living in the earth culture, right? So I think that wherever locally things are going on, kind of pay attention to that, move around, try other things. This is that kind of Saturn side of things, is where you interact with what you know, and you improve that. So it says right here, if you were able to express the Neptunian energy in an uncontaminated form, you would undoubtedly reveal yourself as a vehicle of a final transfiguration, the experience of a unity to life. There are very few people who can consciously express this urge, because it is a collective one, and it can be glimpsed only if the shadows have been absorbed and made part of the conscious expression. The archetype of Neptune ecstasy is paralleled in the declaration of mystics throughout the ages. But the man who has not dealt with his shadow, Saturn, is in the position of becoming hopelessly inflated with his own sense of mission and messianic purpose, right? So the idea is, work on your own shadow stuff. If you're walking down the street, kind of angry, take a look around, try to chill out a bit, see what people are doing around you. Like, work on your own. If you have friends that kind of call out a shadow aspect of yourself, have some humor about it, use it to learn, right? These are all parts of that Neptunian redemption. Okay, so that's kind of like a high level, just a quick, let's say like a quick flavor of Saturn and Neptune. But now I want to kind of talk a little bit now about the idea of, so Pandora in the Avatar films, it's supposed to be near Alpha Centauri, and I think one of the star, Alpha Centauri B or something like that. So this is the nearest star system to the Earth, right? So in Cameron's fake universe, we get to the nearest star system, and you see that in the shots from space of Avatar, there's a giant blue planet that looks just like Neptune. It's a giant blue planet. They call that planet Polyphemus, and then you see the small moon, which is Pandora. And just to kind of go into the Greek mythology of this, Polyphemus is a cyclops of Greek mythology, right? So one of, and that it has a blue spot of like a Jupiter spot on this fictional blue planet, so similar to in appearance to Neptune. So you get that Neptune. This is a planet orbiting Neptune in a way, right? So it's very it clearly looks like Neptune to me. But yeah, guys, leave a comment if you've seen this and you kind of had that thought too. Pandora, on the other hand, you know the story of Pandora's box. So we open this box that has chaos in it, and the chaos gets released. And again, this goes back to Saturn, because Saturn is of the older Titans, right? Saturn is time, it is karma, it's the black cube, it's all of these things, right? That things emerged from the Saturn period, right? So it's the idea of the world is emergent, and then Neptune is sort of the waters that we are now going to swim in. That's what the Avatar films kind of bring us to, this idea of entering into that world. So let's kind of take a little look, a quick tour of the Avatar stories. Again, it's a very, very simple story, both films, Avatar and Avatar Way of Water. They're very simple. I mean, I think the Avatar story, the original one is a bit of an Adam and Eve meets a Pocahontas story, right? Very, very simple plotted. The second film is kind of like the family on the run, and they have to go, the forest people go meet the water people, and and then everything else about the films is mostly the humans as the colonists coming and exploiting of resources, sort of this critique of corporatism, some kind of schizophrenic capitalism. We can kind of go into some of those things, right? But one thing that I found was very interesting is I just thought of Philip K. Dick's Martian time slip stories. I don't know if you guys are familiar with the Martian time slip, but in this story, it's basically, it takes place on Mars. Dick wrote this in the 60s. And the concept, high level concept, again, it's like Ubik. There's a time shifting reality perception component that are in a lot of Dick's stories, which I feel is a parallel to the idea of the avatar as a body. Like you have a human body and then you have an avatar body. And this sort of like, what is real, right? The movie definitely plays with which one are you? Are you the human in the human body, or are you in this avatar body? So it really starts playing with that time slip theme, and I almost want to say like a Heraclitus like theme, right, which we can talk about. So in Martian time slip, there's real estate developers on Mars, and they're all kind of buying up Martian desert, and water is very scarce. There's an indigenous people. On Mars that are Aboriginal. They're described as Aboriginal. And what starts to happen to people on Mars in the story is they start experiencing these dreams and time slips, and almost like a fear of schizophrenia happens, right? And you can see that this schizophrenia theme is also in the Avatar, in the sense of, am I in the Avatar? Like, what's Jake has to decide, right? He can't keep living in both worlds. Like, so he eventually makes the transition over in the film. Spoilers, right? So the some quotes here from it. It says, maybe I'll just read from this. It goes, so one of the characters here works for the water workers union on Mars, right? So shrugging, he said, it's an interesting challenge building a conduit communication between an autistic child and our world. I think there's a lot done for what Arnie says. It could be intermediary. It could do a lot of useful jobs here. It really doesn't matter what Arnie wants to bring out of Steiner's boy, he realized. Probably he's got some solid selfish motive, something that will bring in profit and cold hard cash. I certainly couldn't care less. The fact that I can have it work both ways, he realized. Mr. Yi can lease me the water workers union. I'd be paid by Mr. Yi and he'd be paid by Arnie. Tinkering with broken and malfunctioning mind of a child certainly has more to recommend than tinkering with refrigerators and encoders, if the child is suffering some visions that I know. He knew of the time theory, which Glaub had trotted out on his own. He had read about it in the Scientific American. Naturally, he had read anything on schizophrenia he could get his hands on, and he had originated with the Swiss that Glaub hadn't invented it, right? And he keeps going on to say, that's the whole point. It's designed to make you flee. The vision's for that purpose, to nullify your relations with other people, to isolate you. If it's successful, your life with human beings is over. That's what they mean when they say the term schizophrenia isn't a diagnosis, it's a prognosis. It doesn't say anything about what you have, only about how you'll wind up. And I'm not going to wind up like that, he said to himself, like Manfred Steiner, mute in an institution. I intend to keep my job, my wife and my son, my friendships. He glanced at the girl holding on his arm. Yes, even the love affairs, if such be there. I intend to keep trying, he says. So here we go. This is this kind of paragraph takes you right into the heart of Dick's kind of approach in Martian Time Slip. Not only is there real estate happening, these real estate deals going bad, they start realizing that certain people become sensitive to this time slip of reality, and then they realize that when they time slip, they can actually make changes to the world. And so it ends up with this what's real and what's not, a kind of a schizophrenia comes up. But you also have the themes here of, the very high level themes of colonization that go into both of them. So the idea here is, the colonizers are escaping from Earth in Avatar, right? And they are moving to get the unobtainium, I think, and something else, the whale extract from the second movie. But the humans are looking to exploit the resources of Pandora, having exploited the Earth already. So it's a kind of an extended metaphor of the Earth exploitation, right? And I think that colonization theme, you definitely see the humans as the invaders, right? And in the Martian time slip, these are real estate speculators who are coming in. They have little care for the traditions of the indigenous, but the indigenous have kind of a tradition that's not really explained about how to manage the time slips and how to manage the flux of reality. So when it comes into this schizophrenic discussion, the idea here is you have Jake between two bodies. Is he a human or is he a Na'vi? And it also causes us as the readers to be placed in this schizophrenic kind of cognitive dissonance. And it's on purpose by Cameron. So the idea here is, do you want to be a comfort creature of capitalism, or do you want to go the way of the Na'vi, right? And I've got to say, okay, bravo, it's a good effect, but we have to be careful with these kind of things, right? It's like, it is programming, right? It is manipulative, but in the end, there is a good message there. The good message is, hey, could you do a little bit more gardening? Can we find a way to make a better way for all of us forward? That's not centralized and it's not part of some totalitarian thing, but more part of the way nature has always worked. So in a way, all of that filming, a strange takeaway I had, I've done a lot of scuba diving this past year. And so I love that imagery from the second film of the underwater thing. But the thing is, it just made me want to go scuba dive. Like, we made $1 million of film to give people this virtual effect of scuba diving. But we actually live in a world where you can, and all that diving community is quite active in, I've seen corals being replaced. There's a lot of activism in the ocean stuff. I think Cameron comes from a lot of this activism, right? And I also see that the Na'vi tradition, some of the cut scenes of the first movie, Jake joins the tribe. There's actually a deleted scene where there's some kind of worm and a scorpion or something. He makes a brew and he drinks it and he has an experience. He floats up the world tree, which kind of reminds me of an ayahuasquero kind of thing, right? That was cut from the original film, but you could even see in the first Avatar, they talked about the mycelium that interconnects the trees, how all the trees are talking to each other, so all of life on Pandora is connected. And that's a great theme, and I think Cameron probably took some time after Titanic to go and explore these things, right? So, but when you get into that schizophrenic capitalism, now we get into that idea of maybe anti-Oedipus kind of stuff, where we kind of went into this a little bit in the August Moldenhauer books. So in Impedance and Admittance and Desiring Machines, talk a little bit about Lacanian graph of desire, right? So the Lacanian graph of desire is this idea of statements. I'll show a picture of it. This Lacanian graph of desire is kind of here. So you've got this idea of, you have a statement that's made, right? So you speak something about what you want, what you desire. But really what that statement is informed by is your drive, your egoic drive, and the history. These are all the things you might have said before, right? So this is all the planes. This is the synthesis of your, let's call it your joys and your fears. And what happens is, as this system starts working out, what do you want? What do you desire? The subject begins to drift, right? Avatar kind of makes us feel like we want to be the Na'vi, right? Avatar pushes us towards this agenda where we find ourselves like Jake. Hey, Jake's a human helping the Na'vi. And then Jake becomes a Na'vi. And then by the third movie, he becomes a forest Na'vi who has to integrate with the water Na'vi. But he has a Saturnian, so here's the Neptunian quest, right? The Neptunian quest across these drifting subject is like Parsifal changes on his Grail quest, right? He has to encounter fear. He has to have purity of heart. He has to have all of these qualities tested as he goes through his journey. And the subject drifts. He slightly changes. You slightly change it to someone else. Jake becomes a Na'vi. And now Jake has to redeem, the father of Monkey Boy there in the second film. He's got to help redeem him, right? So I think that the schizophrenic capitalism piece of this comes in, where we start looking at how artificial, how the artificial nature of a virtual world is probably the wrong way to go, right? The virtual world, it's also being called an avatar, right? So it's like maybe you'll be happy in the digital world. I'm not sure if that's the right way to go. I think it's probably more a way of how can we understand from this amazing digital revolution that we have, where we can create movies and create these metaphors. How can we ground that in the physical world and in the natural world, right? So the idea here is, your local parks, conservation, rethinking capitalism with a, I don't want to say believe in every, world government thing. I think as an individual, you have to make a choice, like how you plan to help people realize they didn't need a film to teach them about the natural world. They just needed to be in the natural world and be more present in our world among each other. Pet a cat. The cat's going to be happy, right? And this is sort of like where we talk about Neptune is also that higher spirit, higher octave of Venus. So the Neptunian thing is if you ground Venus's love, right? And if you ground Gnostic love, it's Christian love, right? If you ground yourself in that concept of the ideal of love, like the logos, right? Then the Neptunian is the higher version of that, which is taking the, it's a spiritual undergoing. So if you believe love is on your side, then the Neptunian aspects of the quest become very easy. It's sort of like Parsifal is chosen because he has strength and he's pure, and all of those things are each of us, right? We can each be that kind of character. It's sort of Jake becomes this kind of figure for us in the films, right? So again, some of the other themes that come up with this centralization and colonization is there's definitely a aspect of the subversion of history, right? We see history subverted for the Na'vi. They're kind of trying to cut down their tree. And, I was just watching Truth Stream Media's got a great overlooked series out there right now. They're talking about the Overlook Hotel in The Shining and colonization of indigenous peoples, right? I've got a friend of mine who's in Peru right now, learning to be an ayahuasquero. And I think that these kind of, reattaching to the ancient traditions that were kind of paved over by modern thinking, but are still active. So I think that this is a great time. Terence McKenna would talk about the archaic revival, right? So I think that a lot of what I think is important about the colonization themes in the Avatar films is, look to those indigenous traditions and let's bring them up to the world in a way that's just normal. Like, taking care of your area, like let's make make things better for everyone, right? This kind of idea. I think it's possible. The world's a big place, and I think all that stuff's possible. So, but I also think that the idea of that lost history means that it's not only, indigenous tribes got wiped out by colonists or even spiritual colonists, right? People who wanted to proselytize a religion, as opposed to learning and communicating with local peoples and understanding that, it's not really Satan, it's Saturn. They weren't the Native Americans weren't, the Native Americans, like when we think of the Spanish conquistadors, right? The native peoples weren't satanic, they weren't pagans, they just believed a different thing. And at some point, that clash of culture could have been handled much more gracefully, right? And people could have moved forward together, right? And I think that's the colonialism theme and the suppression of the indigenous that you see Cameron explores. But I kind of feel in a weird way that we're all the indigenous, right? There's probably earlier cultures, archaic cultures, that were paved over by our religions, paved over by our dictatorships and our wars and things, right? So all of those forgotten history that all the colonized feel is sort of the indigenous story. So if you kind of maybe we look at ourselves a bit like we're all indigenous guests of our life on Earth, and have been colonized, each of us, and then we can kind of come out. We can wake up from that. We can sober up from that by the idea of facing the dangers of centralization, the dangers of schizophrenic capitalism, and bring some of those older traditions forward, right? Don't touch the coral, help restore the coral. Don't overdive the coral, don't overboat. Find a way to live in balance with things. I think these are the themes these are the positive themes of Cameron's work, because the guy loves the ocean. Listen, obviously, we don't want world government telling us to do all these things, but I think there's something interesting for all of us to learn in that, right? And I think that some of those forgotten history themes and some of those themes that you see across Cameron's work are really interesting too. The idea of you've got aliens. James Cameron's Aliens was definitely, you've got Sigourney Weaver showing up in both of these series, right? And I think that's kind of interesting how she is a figure who moves from human to become a fully Na'vi. Like, even though she dies, her memories get taken by the tree in the end of the first one, and then her sort of daughter comes. And I think this is a strange callback to Aliens and Alien 3 intersection time, right? So in Aliens, the film ends with Sigourney Weaver, Hicks, and Newt. They go into those pods, right? And they escape the queen of the aliens. And then by Alien 3, we're no longer directed by Cameron, but in the Alien 3, they showed, only Ripley survives, right? Only Ripley survives in Alien 3. It's interesting how Cameron takes that theme and kind of rewrites Alien sequel, because we have the Sigourney Weaver character back in the pod in Avatar 2. And then she mysteriously becomes pregnant. And who is born from this? Like, this is like the Newt child. Like, because it was sort of like there was a happy ending there in Aliens where Newt had a mother again and Sigourney had a daughter again, right? And then I think Cameron goes into that theme again in this movie. He kind of continues that thread across the movies. And Sigourney Weaver is the bridge, where she now becomes this Katie character who's she's like the magical child now. She's like a Ghibli thing, right? She wears you can see it in Avatar: Way of Water. It's amazing. She's got this she's blue figure with pink wings, and it's some kind of underwater cephalopod that gives you oxygen like a scuba tank. And she can mentally control the glowing fish, and she sends them into the shipwreck, and they go and swim and find the people trapped there, right? So obviously she's going to play a more role. She's got a messianic type of role. She's someone who's very in tune with nature. She doesn't even have to plug in the connector. She sort of is swimming in all of the nature. And I think that this is a huge, powerful theme that Cameron is sort of getting us to, about that spirit nature of the interconnectivity of all life. And it's something that's going to be that we're going to have to extend out. And I talk about this a bit in the introduction to, I wrote the introduction to Psychoanalysis of Artificial Intelligence, and talking about this idea of the need for, first of all, how film itself is like an artificial memory upon which our AI is learning from. And some of those complexes that we've placed in film are really telling about us and the voyages we've been on. And I think that, in my introduction to this book, we talk about how each step of the evolution of entertainment, and then the internet, and then finally this parenting of AI will create the need for us to learn how to coexist with AI, right? And I think that this is going to be an interesting field. So we're releasing this as Artificial Psychology of Desiring Machines. The idea is how we will learn to integrate. And I think this theme is in Avatar, right? How will the humans redeem? How can the humans be taught they're not here to strip mine the Na'vi world, right? And we'll see where Cameron takes it. It should be interesting. Another one that's kind of interesting in his cross-pollinating from his works is Cameron does have his Terminator franchise, right? And in Terminator, we also see that rise of the machines. And this is where there's a strange theme in Avatar, because in Avatar, there is also the theme that the Avatar Pandora world symbolizes a digital world that we can live in as avatars, and that the human world So there is a call to digitalization. I think we should be careful with it. I think that the Sarah Connor Chronicles does a great job. I know it's not a Cameron work, but the alien, not the alien, the Terminator in this series is named Cameron. It's the female Terminator that helps John Connor. She's protecting him, sort of like in the first T2, like in T2. And I think that it's interesting that we call the Terminator Cameron here, because there is a theme throughout this series about working together with there's factions in Skynet that are pro-human, and they've sent emissaries back to the past as well. And then this show gets canceled because, well, we can't have the humans and the machines making friends, right? I guess. So then the other themes I see in this Saturn-Neptune tension, right? So the idea here is we can see throughout all of this the Neptunian, the Na'vi story is constantly one where we're trying out this digital version. You know, we kind of go into the forest digitally first, and now we go into the water world digitally, and then we keep echoing back to Jake is a human. So we have to pop out of the world. So it's like getting people used to the idea of spending more time in a digital space, which I question. I think we should be spending more time in natural spaces, right? The real Pandora is go outside to the park, go take a bike ride, right? This is the real Pandora. We live in this beautiful place, the Earth, right? And I think James Cameron believes in this. I think his ocean work has been amazing. And I want us to be cautious on how this gets subverted to, have us buy into some one world thing, right? I want us to think one world, but I don't want someone forcing us to do it, right? And these are the coincidences throughout Time Slip and also Avatar. It shouldn't be a corporate driven thing. It shouldn't be a colonization. It should be something that happens organically because we're humans, and just be more aware of where we're going. And this is sort of that Neptunian dilemma, right? So you have that balance between, am I escaping into a digital world, which is cult-like and Neptunian, or am I looking for ways of grabbing my Saturnian karmic challenge and then opening my heart to understand how to transform that? And this is that shadow work, right? So the idea of the Saturn-Neptune angle is we can see it in, you can look at the way Jake has basically, the family value side of the second movie, right? It really reads like a Swiss Family Robinson kind of story where they're pulling together, they're integrating into the water tribe, they're being respectful of the customs, they're learning the customs one by one, but also they're outside of the custom. That one son of Jake's makes friends with the ostracized whale creature. I don't know what they're called, but you can leave a comment below. But the ostracized whale, everyone thought he's like an evil killer, like there's like a mini Moby Dick inside of Avatar 2, right? And he befriends the killer whale, who actually helps them cross species against the human attack, right? So this idea of befriending the nature is very interesting, right? There's also this idea from Martian Time Slip too, that where you have the idea of the schizophrenia is unsure about what reality is. And when we have in the films the idea of transcending the physical body, and this is kind of leads us into maybe some theosophical concepts, or even concepts of Rudolf Steiner. There's a character in Time Slip. I don't know if it's coincidental, but with Dick it might not be. But there's a character named Norman Steiner who is in the book, and he had a theory about the instability of the time slip nature, and he ends up cutting his own life short. And what he does, I think, and his son is the one who is able to speak in the native language. He understands the glubbish. They don't really explain it, but he can sort of speak the Na'vi language, sort of like Jake does, right? So I think that there's this idea of you listening to the natural flow of things and that quest for redemption to transcend things. But we see this transcendent, spiritual transcendence with the one tree, with the way that they can meld with the animals, but also the idea of the blue people, right? So again, Venus, Venusians, and Neptunians, you have that love concept. Neptune is the higher aspect of Venus. But then we have the idea of Lemuria, pre-Atlantean Lemuria, or Venusians as blue blue avatars, or even the idea of, like we mentioned Krishna before, kind of like this Krishna form as the what is the blue person really represent? Well, if you think of it in Krishna consciousness, it's actually quite a great idea, and it's actually a Christ idea as well, right? Krishna and Christ. The idea of it is the second coming of Christ within you is acting more like Christ and being more personal like Krishna, right? So the idea of Saint Teresa of Lisieux, for example, the idea of if we acted like everyone else was the baby Jesus or the baby Krishna, right? This is like that the final commandment, like loving each other, right? But that idea of it doesn't mean it's like a touchy-feely thing, or doesn't mean it's like a namby-pamby thing. It means something more like, hey, there's Saturn forces at work that we have to wrestle with. There's Neptunian quests for redemption that we can take on. Let's embody those things and let's live fruitful lives. Let's reconnect to the land. Let's undo some of these things that were brought on by the schizophrenic capitalism, that was brought on by the mass global colonization of us. We are the indigenous humans of Earth, right? We are the indigenous tribe. Let's remember some of our human things. Let's go talk to people who are from other traditions and bring that stuff forward. And I think this is the best parts of this film, right? I think it represents that higher octave, right? That higher octave of things. And that metaphor of the Heraclitus quote is, I really think, when we talk of the way of water and also the time slip, I think the way of water, the flowing of water, and the Neptunian flowing of water is also a key theme to this, and the idea of, we only step into the river once, and we have to really see time as like we are in a constant change, and there's a fluidity of time and space, right? And how this film kind of shows us the evolution of Jake from the human to the human avatar to the avatar, and now to an avatar who's learning more about his avatar planet and making more friends with the rest of Pandora, learning the traditions, like learning the archaic traditions, right? And kind of coming through a redemption passage, let's say. There's actually a redemption passage is being created, being pioneered by Jake, and now followed by the new guy, the monkey boy's father there, the villain guy, who's also a Navi now. And he just needs to connect to the Navi. Like, he's already started, right? He's connected to the bird. He just needs to shed off some of his capitalist schizophrenia, and hopefully those will be themes in the future film, right? So that idea of fluidity of time and reality. Final thoughts, I guess, on Neptune. I think I'll probably do some more of these Neptunian dives. I might even just go deep into the book. I'm going to be doing, like I mentioned, a deep dive into Desiring Machines, Volume 1, which will talk about the graph of desire, and then also talk about this galvanic theory of Moldenhauer's about using electrical engineering terms to talk about the flows, how we resist things, how we impede things, how we admit things, how we are susceptible to things. And I think that also overlaps with the Neptune, so we'll probably bring that in. And then also psychoanalysis of artificial intelligence. Cameron comes up a lot because in that book we talk about our film depictions of artificial intelligence as informing the human AI archetype. Like, there's a lot of human AI archetypes. The fearful robot takes over, AI takes over. How do we treat those and prevent those maladaptations from happening in the future rise of artificial intelligence, right? So that's artificial psychology. We'll be doing some of that. We'll keep going with this Neptune, Saturn theme. Liz Green, great stuff. Go check out her books. As usual, guys, go check out our books. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next podcast. Hope this was interesting. You can leave your comments below, and I'll talk to you on the next episode. Bye-bye.